Hi, I'm Terry Patar. I lead the Jane's Intelligence Unit, which responds to specific tasking from national security and government organisations, particularly helping them understand current, emerging and future threats. To find out more about the threat assessment support provided by Jane's, please visit our website, janes.com/threats. On this episode of the World of Intelligence podcast, I'll be talking to my guests, Air Vice Marshal Sean Corbett, who after a career Air Force, including working in senior intelligence roles, is now a senior advisor to Jane's, and Harry Kemsley, also formerly of the RAF, but currently the Global Vice President of Jane's, responsible for our national security and government products and services. So welcome to both of you, and thanks for joining us on this webcast. It'll be great to get your thoughts in this sort of current time that these extraordinary times we're living in at the moment, on intelligence and how it's used, and particularly thinking in terms of our audience, this sort of interest they have in maybe doing intelligence better in the ways that they are currently doing it, but also thinking outside of that field. What are the sort of things you think that they can bring in that they're not currently doing, perhaps, which they should be thinking about? And so I've got a few questions around those general areas, which I think it will be useful to get your thoughts on, and actually be very valuable to get your insights in terms of your previous experience, but also where you think intelligence, and in this context we're talking obviously about open source intelligence, where that's going to go in the future, and so where we see it developing, and where we see sort of extra value and extra importance being placed on it. So with the first question I wanted to sort of kick off with was something specifically for those people in our audience who are working in intelligence at the moment, giving them some thoughts from yourselves and some of your experience in terms of supplying intelligence to commanders and senior decision makers. What has been, in your experience, of utmost importance, and what are the most challenging difficulties? I'll go first.
Sean?
Yeah, do you want to take it first, Harry?
We could be here all afternoon on that one. I think in a few words, I would start that by saying that in my experience of making decisions, one of the biggest concerns I had is that I had a complete and accurate set of information to make a decision on, and having the assurance that I was making a decision on the best available information was often a concern of mine. And actually, that's one of the big driving factors for me in terms of how we're developing Jane's, but we'll come to that later, I'm sure. So the ability to step into a decision-making cycle with assured, complete, accurate information is key, but equally being able to do that in time. It's all very well having the perfect information that arrived 5 minutes after it was needed and therefore had no real value at all. So doing it in a timely and accurate fashion is evidently key. Giving the commander some assurance, or the decision maker some assurance they're working with the best available information, is going to be important. And I think, and you mentioned open source information, and clearly Jane's, being an open source information and intelligence business, would say this, but it's true. Increasingly now, the open source environment, the publicly available information, is the source we go to first. It is the place that intelligence communities should and could go to first to get the best and clearest picture about emerging events. If you think about the omnipotent availability of social media, for example, as an event unwinds in real time, most of the information available about it in the first period of minutes, hours, is available through open sources. It's not available through classified means necessarily. And so getting plugged into that, understanding what's happening in near real time or in real time, demands that we get into the open source environment. But equally, as things start to emerge beyond that initial moment, again, there's lots of great information available in the open source and publicly available information. The key, though, before I hand over to Sean, because I could be here for the rest of the afternoon on this one topic, the key, though, is doing it in an assured way, getting to the place where you've got verified outcomes, not just raw data pouring out of open sources. And I think the curation of what's in the open source is the key for me, getting that to the commander in a way that the commander can use on time, but with assurance. Sean?
Yeah, it won't surprise to know that I agree with all of that. So looking at it from the end of the other end of the telescope, in terms of the person that was providing that senior commander with the intelligence, there's a saying in the military that, if you get 100% of the intelligence late, even 5 minutes, it's pointless, whereas 60% is on time is far better. And of course, these commanders need to make decisions with the best available information they have at the time. So they're going to make that information. So time is critical. And of course, the second part of that is the accuracy of it. We always used to talk about it as fighting the CNN factor. And the perceived wisdom is that, you're never going to fight the social media, the BBC reporting, etc. So the intelligence role is actually to get it accurately, later. I don't subscribe to that, and I don't think many people do anymore, because you can, with all the open source, you can sort of not beat the CNN factor, but be in parallel with it. The difference being that, exactly as Harry said, is you've got to be right, you've got to be accurate. The first report is pretty much 100% of the time wrong or inaccurate, or at least not complete. So using the open source data, which is going to be immediately available, that kind of hones you into what the questions may be, and then you can use the exquisite stuff to validate that and to assure, as Harry said, and it's absolutely essential. So a commander is going to want to, and he's got to trust his intelligence specialist. He's got to trust what you're saying to him, and that only comes with reputation by getting it right. And you can only get it right by using all the available data and all the available information. One of the things we used to struggle with was being and even more so now, actually, is being overwhelmed with the amount of information that's coming in. Now, sometimes that brings with it a conscious or an unconscious bias, and that's both from the analyst perspective, but also the commander's perspective. I could tell you some quite scary stories in Afghanistan where, one particular 3-star commander, who will remain nameless, was so adamant that his thesis on what was happening with the Taliban at the time in Afghanistan was right, that he refused to accept or believe any intelligence that said that basically the Taliban were resurging, and say, no, our tactics are right. So there was a moral component to this as well. As an intelligence specialist, you've really got to have that moral courage to say it how it is, but then you've got to be able to back that up with the evidence. And it's quite tricky, actually, particularly if you're a relatively junior person in front of a senior officer. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen sometimes. And then the other aspect, that's the external one, is the radio 4 factor, as I used to call it. The first thing you do on the way to work in somewhere like Permanent Joint Headquarters is put on radio 4, because you know that your commanders are going to be listening to it on the way in as well. And the first question they'll ask you in the intelligence brief is something about that. So you've got to A, anticipate the question, and B, have an answer that's a little bit more value added, because at the end of the day, it's the value added that is really important in the intelligence process. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. Validated, assured, rapid information.
It's interesting you mentioned that sort of that morning aspect of trying to anticipate what your senior leaders or senior decision makers and commanders have been reading in the news. It rings a bell from my experience as well of having somebody come in and drop a newspaper on your desk and say, right, tell me more about this, and being able to anticipate that, I think is also vital for analysts. When you talk about sort of making sure that information is assured and verified, and this is a question for Harry first. Harry, how does Janes go about making sure that we can be very confident about the open source intelligence that we produce, and how are we securing our intelligence that we provide to customers in this sort of day and age?
Well, a point that Sean made a second ago about the vast amount of content that's available out there that you can get through very simple tools. You can go and collect lots of information. It is the first thing. You need a lot of information, and you need it from a lot of different sources. I'll come back to the different sources in a moment. You also need an ability to absorb, understand, connect, fuse, all those sorts of steps through the collation and processing stage of an intelligence cycle, and then the ability to start to verify and analyze. All of those elements are elements of the way Janes curates its content. But what I would say first, in terms of a principal statement to answer that question, is that Janes doesn't take raw content and pass it straight to a customer, because to do so would be to just fill the customer's ears, their IT systems, with noise potentially, and that's unhelpful. So we may not get things out within seconds of our receipt of it. We'll get it out in minutes to hours to ensure that when it's arrived, it's been verified, it's been cross-referenced, it's been assured, to use that word again, in order that when the person who's going to read it does read it, they find value in it and can trust it to be used, not necessarily actionable in the sense that anything Janes produces will create an immediate action by the customer, but maybe gives them an indicator, a pointer to where they may need to go next, as Sean put it a moment ago, in terms of their more exotic capabilities they have available to them behind the firewall. So the way Janes does that in very simple terms is to have multiple sources. One of the great things about being in part of the Janes community is the hundreds, nay thousands of contributors we have who are on the ground in the countries, working in the communities, within the organizations that we are reporting on and talking about in our intelligence. So we will, of course, use modern technology to scrape content off the internet, go and find publicly available sources, of course. We will also, though, use this very large contributor network. The combination of those two very large sets of content data will then be analyzed through what we call the triple lock process. And triple lock process is basically, in essence, 3 communities of people: an editorial community who are auditing and checking for biases and so on and valid sources, the analyst community in terms of what have you been analyzing, why do you believe that's the right source, why do you believe that's a credible outcome from that event, for example, and then thirdly, the people that actually project that out into the community of customers, the front of house, if you like. They all have to agree on what we are producing, publishing, and discussing. And then that third community I mentioned, the people that are front of house actually getting the information out to the customers, they're also the feedback loop. So that if a customer says, well, James, that's all very well, but I know that's not true, on the occasions that that happens, which isn't often, but when it happens, we take that very readily back into triple lock and find out why we didn't know that to have been false, that we published that information, and actually then revise our editorial processes, our collection processes, verification processes very regularly. About every 6 months, we have a full review of our editorial and publishing processes to ensure that what goes out the door gets, if you will, the Janes kite stamp on it to say that is verified and assured by Janes. And that continual process of refining, reviewing, updating our tradecraft, to coin a phrase, over the last many decades is why I'm very confident that when we put that in front of you, it's going to be usable.
It's really interesting. Something you mentioned that just there, Harry, about the not passing on or not just sort of giving clients a lot of information to ingest, raw information, because obviously, as Sean mentioned earlier, that there is that element of overwhelm at the moment. We've got so much information out there potentially available that we can bring in, and a lot of it can be duplicate. We're obviously dealing with issues like disinformation these days as well, and the importance of not just passing that on wholesale. I think that's definitely been an issue that certainly we've seen in some of the conversations and projects we've done with clients where they are using, say, fusion processes or tools and platforms that ingest lots of information, and it just creates a lot of noise for them. I think that's particularly pertinent within those contexts where different countries are working together. So we think about international organizations like NATO or other types of alliances. I wanted to sort of maybe pivot a little bit towards thinking about the sort of threats that we're now facing, or countries and alliances are now facing, especially as we come out of or start to emerge from the crisis of the current coronavirus pandemic, and what might come next, and how that might affect some of these cooperative arrangements, particularly around intelligence sharing, because I think that's one of the things that perhaps we can also touch upon in terms of open source intelligence and where that sits in terms of helping different countries, different organizations work together and share intelligence. So I know there's a lot. I've probably touched on a few different things there, but maybe Sean, if you can pick up on some of those, and then Harry, I'll come to you and we can talk about how all of those things are shifting at the moment and where we see things going.
Yeah, sure. Intelligence sharing, absolutely critical to do, easy to say but hard to actually put into action, just because of the different levels of sharing, the different allies and partnerships. I've been heavily involved with the Five Eyes, and that is it is a pretty close club, and the intelligence sharing there is very, very good. But actually, we're never going to fight a war as a Five Eyes. It's always Five Eyes plus whoever. So you've got to make sure that everybody is fighting from the same level playing field in terms of the information that's available for them to do what they need to do. Extremely difficult at the classified levels, not least of which the communications nodes don't always work. It took years to put together, for instance, the Afghan mission network, which is actually not bad at all. But huge amounts of money have gone in there, and so sometimes you're not going to have the time and the resource to do that. So that's where open source really does come in. So if you can use your exquisite or national intelligence and validate it with open source and share the open source that actually matches that, then the world is in a far better place, because you can actually get it to those who need it. And that's not just with the partners either. That's people that don't have necessarily the connectivity at the top secret and secret levels out in the field. And that really does make the open source piece really important. Harry mentioned tradecraft. Tradecraft absolutely critical. And this is all about trusting the information that's provided. Just going back slightly to your last question, in terms of, you know, how you use that information, you've got to make sure that you consider every single piece of data. You've got to do it objectively. Now, over time and with experience, you learn what data is more relevant, what is more accurate, partly through that feedback loop, but also by using certain tradecraft. And it is to an extent down to experience. So if you've got lots of nations using the same data that is sure as trusted, basically, then you know that any analysis and assessment they come in is also going to be trusted, particularly if they're using the same tradecraft. And this is where a regional perspective really comes in. A lot of people used to say to me when I worked in the Defence Intelligence Agency, why should we share more intelligence? And my answer really was, well, why wouldn't you? Because the reciprocal is going to be there. And I always use New Zealand as an example here. You know, everyone says, oh, New Zealand, not a huge country in terms of intelligence production, but boy, do they produce some really good stuff, because they've got a unique insight into their part of the world. Everyone looks at the world from your own lens. They have relationships with China, for instance, that nobody else does. They have access to many of the South China Sea nations that others wouldn't, and they can give that perspective and add value where, you know, even some of the bigger nations can't do that. So it's not a one-way flow. It really is making the best of all worlds.
Yeah, maybe Harry, if I can bring you in on that, that's that sort of point to pick up on how that cooperation then translates into dealing with some of these major strategic threats that we're now facing, and that some of the national and international security organizations are having to cooperate and share intelligence on. So, you know, what are those kind of strategic threats at the moment? How do you see those playing out? What do you see changing as a result of the current crisis? I know it's still, there's a lot of uncertainty, but obviously with intelligence, you know, that's what we deal with.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, trying to find shape in chaos, trying to find some degree of certainty in the uncertainty is probably one of the greatest contributions an intelligence analyst can give to decision makers. Giving some shape, some sort of scenario view of what the future might look like is key. Now, we don't know what the new normal will look like post-pandemic. I think we can all be reasonably confident that governments and populations will take health matters more seriously. When we hear about an incident happening in another part of the world, we won't assume it's only for them to worry about. We will think about it more carefully. But getting to the more strategic perspectives, I don't think we can be clear about what's going to happen, but I think we can be clear that it's going to probably have sort of a whiplash effect. We could be swinging from a period of our recent history where we've started to see increasing amounts of cooperation to maybe now flicking across to more competition, particularly around scarce resources. Or if we start to see large migrations of people, there's going to be concerns about border security, more isolationist policies perhaps starting to emerge. And within an international organization like NATO, or even the Five Eyes community, you know, where there is perceived competition between members for certain types of information or resources, that could become a stress point across the membership of that organization. One that, by the way, I think the likes of NATO have encountered in different ways over the decades it's been in existence, and it has endured. So I think what's key for me is that whilst we may see some shifts in the short term for some military priorities, we may see more military aid, civil powers type work going on for international organizations, perhaps more logistics support for the provision of medical supplies across international distances. As the emerging picture from the developing world starts to hit our screens in terms of, well, what is happening behind the veil of uncertainty in Yemen right now? What's happening in Syria? What's happening on the ground in these camps that we've seen grow with tens of thousands of refugees? Is COVID happening as much as we expect it to be in those areas? And if that is the case, how do we deal with it? For me, none of those questions can be answered definitively, but what can be certain is that we have to be ready to pivot from one direction to the next and retain cohesion in membership groups like NATO to ensure that we have some hope of dealing with these transnational strategic issues. So for me, I think that the simple answer to that question is we don't know the future. NATO has been resilient in the face of very significant challenges over the year, including potential infighting amongst its own members. And I think what we need to be ready for is to pivot towards the new reality, the new challenges that are waiting for us as the situation develops, particularly perhaps in the developing world, which at the moment is somewhat opaque to us. We're very good at seeing what's happening in our own backyards. We're very, very good at seeing what's happening in the local cities and towns in the first world. I'm not convinced we're as clear yet about what's happening inside some of these developing countries that have no doubt got the same problems we have, but with nowhere near the support that we have in our own country in terms of healthcare, etc.
Sean, maybe I can come to you on that one in terms of the strategic threat picture and strategic threat assessments. How do you see sort of that shifting? And is threat assessment becoming harder to do given all the huge level of uncertainty that Harry's just described there?
Yeah, it is a very big question. I think firstly in terms of the grand strategy, I think we are seeing a return to the national interest, the nation state, but for me, I don't think it ever really went away. If you look at NATO and if you sat on the military committees, as I have spent a lot of time doing, you'd realise that actually, talking about NATO as an entity sometimes is quite unhelpful. It is 30 nations sat together, giving their own national views and then coming to a compromise. Now, sometimes that leads to the lowest common denominator, but actually, sometimes it doesn't. Almost every year there is some sort of crisis that then leads to what's the relevance of NATO? Will NATO endure? And every year it does, because it's the only show in town, really. If you didn't have a NATO, you'd have to recreate it. It does some virtuous stuff, and importantly, it's a political construct that has a security angle to. Well, it is about security, but it is political, and just keeping those people, those organisations, nations around the table discussing things and having solidarity, which is absolutely critical. It's there to act as a deterrent. One of the questions you could ask now is with Article 5, what is, and this leads to your next part of your question, what is the threat out there? The sort of traditional third shock army coming over the inner German border, probably not relevant anymore, although that's a debatable discussion right now as well. But you've got all the new emerging threats out there, the hybrid warfare, the rogue actors, the non-state actors, cyber warfare. One of the vignettes I like to use in terms of sort of bringing the Article 5 to life is that, if I walked down Washington, DC, maybe 7 or 8 years ago and said, if a malign country was to impact in your political process, for voting for the president, would you see that as an act of war? And they'd probably go, oh yeah, absolutely, we'd do something about it. But that happened. So the next step is, okay, so if all the traffic lights got put out in Washington, DC, would you see that as an act of war? Now, there are those that think that the traffic flow would be better, but we'll pass that. But now the question with, well, actually, I don't know about that. Is that an act of war, isn't it? If you're to say that someone put all the lights out on the eastern seaboard, is that an act of war? Probably right now they'd say yes, but there's no real threshold by which to go. And if you get in somewhere like NATO and have that discussion, you're going to get 30 different answers. So that is the really complex challenges that they're going to have to consider going forward. Is what does constitute the Article 5 the threat? To one threat to all. Hopefully we'll never come to that, but it is a real challenge there. And of course there are those state actors now that are behaving, we'll just say irresponsibly, but certainly outside of international norms. One thing in the West, in NATO, in the Five Eyes, we do act within international norms in a reasonable way. Is that a relevant way of looking at things now, or do we then lose any advantage we have by, playing cricket with a straight bat, as I would say? So really, really challenging questions there. And does NATO have the agility to answer those? Personally, not as NATO, it will put together organisations, talk, have treaties, have discussions, and press conferences. But it's down to individual nations to decide where they sit on that, and when it comes to the fore, to actually then act accordingly. What's all that got to do with intelligence sharing? Well, it makes it even more important now that with all the plethora of threats out there, everything that I've been saying, from resurgent states all the way down to individual lone wolves, to pandemics, which is probably the greatest threat we've come across in our lifetime, arguably, to climate change. You've got to share intelligence to find out what the ground truth is, and therefore what you're going to do about it, and get those regional and national perspectives.
Yeah, I think if I may just step on top of that as well, I think if you think about all those moving parts and all the difficulties we're going to have to see what's really happening in real time underneath all of those huge topics that Sean just reeled off, opportunistic states who are potentially looking at all kinds of activities that aren't getting looked at right now because we're so all focused on the pandemic, and then the non-state actors who are probably doing the same, who are seeing opportunities, no doubt, with all kinds of nefarious activities that just aren't being watched because police forces, armies, the public safety is being so focused on the health end of the spectrum rather than the military end of the spectrum of public safety. And for me, the ability for large organizations like NATO, the corporate organizations like Jane's, to step together and start to build a clearer picture, a more complete and accurate picture, means that we've got greater chance of finding the weak signals in the noise that may well be indicators of emerging threats. And it's about finding those weak signals that I think a combination between government organizations and commercial organizations like Jane's is where we see the future. The ability to partner, to fill the flanks that the organization we're talking to doesn't have the capability or capacity to do that. That's where I think organizations like Jane's become relevant, in that we can start to fill those gaps, start to build capability around where our customers either don't want to build capability, don't have the time, money or effort to do it. But if we don't, then we run the risk of not detecting those emerging threats, not seeing the thread that's starting to emerge in the noise, that after the fact would look back and say, why on earth didn't we do something about finding that and deal with it before it became a real problem? Also often the stitch in time, saving 9, is so relevant in intelligence terms. Just that little bit of investment in something that could have been detected, that wasn't done, that allowed it to become a real problem. And there are plenty of examples of that in history. So I think it's vital we get this partnership and also recognition that more eyes on the same problem, more minds engaged in the same problem, get a higher chance of success than less. Sean.
Yeah, just to focus on that a little bit from what we haven't talked about yet, and the sort of global economic downturn, which is going to be significant. Well, it is significant now. So, extrapolate from that, the likelihood is that defence budgets are going to be robbed for, higher priority things, quite understandable. Now, what does that mean for defence capabilities? It probably means less expeditionary activity. It may mean, some of the capital projects either being delayed or even cancelled. And it means really that the focus is going to be more internally by nations. The so what of that means that, we have to keep an eye on what's going on in the world. The ungoverned spaces, we're seeing now the same conditions that created Al-Qaeda and ISIL again, with people keeping their eyes away from those spaces, with people in extreme poverty, and organisations that are able to fill that space. We've got to keep an eye on those, otherwise, that threat that we haven't even looked at will come and kick us in the face.
Yeah.
And of course, that all leads to everything we've been talking about. That information is key, but it's got to be the right information. It's got to be global. It's got to be interconnected. And there's many examples, putting together the 9/11 piece that, in hindsight, which is a wonderful thing, possibly we could have the pieces have come back with, it would have happened. It was never going to happen at the time because there was so much information. It really was needles in several haystacks. But that's the sort of thing we're going to have to come and get together and find the answers to those questions. And that is only going to be done, A, by using all of that open source information from whatever source it is, everything from commercial satellites to, scraping of social media, et cetera, and trying to at least hone down where to look and where to direct the more exquisite collection capabilities.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Talking about those sort of trends and the kind of drivers that we see building to emerging threats and future threats. I mean, Harry, maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been working on recently at Janes in terms of some of the discussions we've been having with customers around helping them plan for how to deal with or how to understand those types of threats as they emerge. So some of the scenario analysis, contingency planning support that we've been working on, because I think that's an area where, as Sean's described, as capabilities maybe get very focused in on particular areas, that they aren't able to sort of look outside of the natural arc that they're focused on, and especially if we move to an era where there are sort of cutbacks and they are having to do more with less. You know, what sort of, how does that play into the sort of discussions you've been having and some of the things that we've been looking at providing our customers with in terms of services?
Well, it's a huge topic right now for a lot of the customers, particularly those customers that perhaps lack some of the esoteric capabilities that Sean keeps alluding to, or indeed they have them but not to this scale, the capacity they would like to have them, and therefore are struggling to fully understand their immediate environment and the wider environment they operate in, both geopolitically but also economically, militarily, etc. Now, there are so many factors at play, and so many of those factors are completely unpredictable. You end up with this huge amount of uncertainty. As I was saying earlier, trying to find shape in that, trying to find something that you can actually start to predict and feel as though could support decision making is a real challenge, particularly if you take each of them as individual factors and try and analyze them to the nth degree and then fully appreciate how that will come together. That's a really, really hard thing to do. And I'm not convinced that many times that's successful either. A different approach that we've been taking with our customers globally is to help them develop an understanding of potential scenarios and using a scenario analysis platform to begin to address, nay, embrace the uncertainty, allow the uncertainty to be a part of your scenario, and then determine, if you like, from one perspective, you know, the most likely, the least likely, the most dangerous, that sort of analysis to emerge out of your analysis of a developed scenario. Now, generally speaking, us humans are pretty good at dealing with complex matters, but not at an infinitely small scale and then rebuilding it from the atomic back to the macro detail. It's better that we operate at the conceptual level, at the scenario level, and then dig down into that as required in a sort of top-down approach. So the work we've been doing, Terry, with a lot of our customers globally has really focused on how we can help them develop an understanding of various types of scenario that may be in the future, the new normal, and then looking at how we can understand those scenarios, start to build contingency plans, but equally, and I would argue even more importantly, start to look for those signposts that we're heading towards scenario 6 rather than scenario 12. That we can begin to see that actually it's sort of hybrid between what we thought might be the least likely but most dangerous. That's starting to emerge in some respects. Those signposts, those abilities to detect the emerging threats or the emerging reality of the future is probably one of the most important things that we can do for our customers through that scenario analysis, because it's in those signposts that the decision makers get a chance to A, mitigate threats, but equally to seek to exploit opportunities that may be in their national interest, whether that's commercial opportunities or whether that's something to a more economic, or that's up to them. But our ability to help them signpost the future, see where that vector is starting to emerge, and then deal with it early enough is the key support that we've been offering. Clearly, it's a complex process, it's a time-consuming process, but what we're finding is that by doing this work early enough, we build a framework of understanding of the potential futures, plural, and from that we build scenario signposts, and from that we start to help our customers plot the path. In all of the above, we're finding that the relationship, the partnership between Janes and its customers, as I was saying in answer to your earlier question, is now becoming the center of the relationship. It's a real partnership. They outsource to us things they know we can do for them, and we give insource into them answers to the questions they need to then take inside the vault behind the firewall that only they can deal with, which clearly is not where Janes works. So it's about scenario analysis, it's about developing those scenarios and the signposts.
Sure, maybe if I can come to you on that, because Harry's given a great description of the sort of scenario analysis we do at Janes and how it assists some of our customers. But maybe from your perspective, have you used that sort of process before in terms of strategic planning? I'm sure you have, but maybe you can give a sense of the value of doing that. And also just touching back on some of the previous points you raised about the current uncertainties we have around threat pictures, and especially with economic disruption, and then looking much further ahead. Well, perhaps not so much further ahead, but thinking about things like climate change. How hard is it at the moment for strategic planners to really bring all of that together, and how valuable is a scenario analysis process to that?
Yeah, well, the answer is obviously incredibly important. But just going back onto what Harry said, what is critical is that using that end-to-end approach. There is an awful lot of work put into tradecraft within the intelligence community. It's got to be measurable. You've got to be able to prove what your analysis is. I mean, ironically, some of the best assessments are the lowest confidence, but that doesn't mean to say that you don't have the data. It just means that you're not sure about the data. So, back to the validation thing. But if I look at it, and we've been doing a lot of work really, getting ourselves into the head of the intelligence analyst. The intelligence analyst is there to provide the so what and the what if. I would never let any of my intelligence officers brief any senior without giving the so what and the what if. They even have to say that just to make sure they did, because anybody can read the papers, as my boss used to say. But you've got to take it from, from all the data, get all the data together. You've got to collate it, you've got to manage it, you've got to weigh it. That takes an enormous amount of time. And I suspect if you talk to 100 analysts out there, and they're quite rare beasts, but if you find 100 analysts out there, and you said, what is the number one concern I've got? It would be managing the data, whether that's collecting it off different systems, whether it's putting it into the same Excel spreadsheet, dare I say, and then putting it into the right buckets. Probably a disproportionate amount of their time is spent doing that, when what they should be doing is doing that so what, now what, okay, what does this mean? And that's the predictive analysis piece, which is the nirvana in the intelligence community that we've never really cracked as well as we could do. What is going to happen next? What do I need to be worrying about? And you can't do that if your head's down in managing data. So that is where a really big part of James will help. But actually, as Harry was alluding to, when you start to be able to apply machine learning, artificial intelligence, and pulling those seemingly disparate threads into one particular theme, thinking, oh, actually, I didn't know that was linked to that. That then gives you that richer form of data by which you can make your assessment. You are always going to have the human in the loop at some stage, and you will hear within the community, slightly digressing, that there is a threat out there from artificial intelligence and machine learning. I don't believe that at all. What I do believe is it will make the assessments so much better, so much more rich and valuable to the decision maker at what level, that actually you're going to reinforce the intelligence analysts' rationale, if you like, reason to be. So that end-to-end approach is really important, and working out the relevant pieces in which James can help, and to be frank, it's all of the above, including your very clever analysts. Then that takes a huge chunk out of the classified stuff. And back to the massive breadth and depth of challenges, things like, back to the Ebola crisis, within the community, we didn't have a clue how to deal with that. It's a non-traditional threat. You couldn't see it, feel it, or shoot it, but it was as important to understand it as anything else. Now, that was an unclassified, we call it a war, actually. It was an unclassified operation, but it took us an awful long time to get anywhere close to having the same understanding as we would, for example, about the third shock army coming over the German border. So, and that's there to stay. Climate change, water insecurity, all the things that are really important, and all are interconnected, but we don't understand them. And that is, I see, is a huge area where James can almost take the lead on that, and lead the intelligence community rather than the other way around.
I have to say, I must come in on that point, having spent so many hours and months in the recent years looking at that particular point. So the point John just made there, for me, centres around an ability to fuse data together, because you can be confident that what you're fusing together should be fused in that way. The entities, to use the modern parlance, are well and accurately defined. they are distinct and well resolved, so you can start to connect them in a reliable and standardized way. Janes has had to do that to itself because it's got 120 years of data that it's been collecting, and to sort that out and make it available in a coherent way to its customers means that internally we had to look at all the technologies available and apply them to ourselves. And what we found over the last, well, certainly the last 2 or 3 years, is that there is no shortage at all of providers of artificial intelligence who will tell you they can solve all the problems that you've got with their technology. There are literally tens of them that we've met. What we found within that community, though, are very, very few in the defense environment that actually know what defense data really means. When you say to a machine Typhoon, does it mean weather system? Does it mean a type of caravan? I happen to know it's a caravan known as the Typhoon GX, by the way. I'm not a caravaner, but there is one there. Or indeed the aircraft, right? Now, in data terms, that's not unusual. Disambiguation, as I believe it's called, is not an unusual problem. But in defense, it's an acute issue, really acute. And the ability to do that reliably and do that in a stable way is something that Janes is uniquely placed to do, because we've had to do it to ourselves for all the open source information we've collected over the last 120 years. And it is a vast amount of data. And we've connected it all. We've created a data dictionary that is now stable and standardized. We've got ontologies that connect all the elements together. And that is allowing us to step into artificial intelligence conversations with certain providers and help accelerate the rate at which their machine learning algorithms are learning about the data in the defense environment, because we're uniquely placed to do it. But by the way, just to stress again, I agree with Sean. Artificial intelligence is not a threat, it's an opportunity. And we prefer the phrase augmented intelligence because it's really about saying to an analyst, don't spend the time collecting, collating, verifying. Let the machine do that. Machines are pretty good at finding large amounts of information, sorting it for you, connecting it for you, and then presenting it to you so you can do the value-added piece, which is the follow-on. And that is precisely what's going on in Janes right now. So under the covers, not yet fully revealed to our customers in all respects, is this data-centric data model that Janes has been working on for quite a long time now, which very shortly will be public, which will allow our customers to work with their data in the defense and government space in a way they've never been able to before, because they'll actually be able to pour it in, see it sorted before their eyes and connected in a way that allow them to work with it in a much more effective way. And that's something for the future, but I'm very excited about the results we're already seeing for ourselves internally with our own intelligence cycle in support of our customers. So that's definitely coming.
That's really interesting. I think, especially where you use that term augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence, because I think that's a really important point. I think there's probably you probably write books about the misuse of the term artificial intelligence, because it does seem to have cropped up everywhere as a buzzword, and it's probably not justified in 99% of those contexts. But from the perspective of somebody who has been an intelligence analyst, I would say having to spend less time wrangling data and trying to collate it and organize it, and more time, as Sean said, working out the so what and the what if is going to make everyone's job so much better. And be able to give them the ability to do so much more. And from the Janes perspective, if we can help them do that, I think that's all to the good.
Yeah.
Just sort of bringing this discussion to a close then, in terms of sort of any final comments or remarks you wanted to make, or just any other thoughts you had to sort of add to the discussion we've had, because it's been fascinating in terms of picking apart the challenges that everyone's facing right now, where we're likely to go next, and some of the things that we need to be thinking about collectively across national security, government, public safety, and intelligence work. Sean, did you have any other things you wanted to add to that, or any other sort of comments you wanted to go back to or touch upon?
I think my final strapline really would be the importance, the relative importance of open source now against the highly classified stuff. I come from a community which has a certain culture. They are incredibly professional and very good at what they do, but it's all still in many ways about that classified intelligence. There are still those that will deny that using open source is actually a form of intelligence at all. That paradigm, I can't believe I used the word paradigm, but that paradigm has now changed. Whether that's appreciated or not, it is. So whereas you can pluck a figure out the air, 80% of intelligence products has come from classified sources, with a little bit of sprinkling of open source, to add flavour to it or to fill the missing gaps. I think there's an inevitability, whether it's 6 months, whether it's a year, whether it's 5 years, of that reversing in terms of the open source being the core to go to work out what's happening, and then the classified stuff being used to validate and assure that that 80% or whatever it happens to be. So it's looking at it from a different perspective. There's so much information about out there. For me, that's an inevitability. So I think that is the future.
I think if I was going to add to that, and agree with everything Sean just said, Terry, but my final word on that would be, yes, I absolutely now am fully convinced of the power of open sources, but it needs to be exploited well. The open source environment is going to drown you in data. That is an inevitability. You go and look at the Twitter feed, you get the hose pipe, as it's sometimes called, pointed at you, and it will cover every information system's available storage space in minutes with raw data. But what do I do with it? How do I actually use it? So the ability to engage with the open source environment is actually the bit that most people don't fully appreciate how to do. They therefore will do it badly, and therefore will assume that what they're getting from open sources is of no value. When you learn how to do it well, and Jane's clearly over 120 years has become fairly proficient at doing that, you then get to see the true power that you can exploit out of the open source or publicly available information domain. And when you can do that is when you get to the point that Sean just made, which is open source becomes an indicator, a warning of things that are emerging perhaps, or maybe it becomes a way of validating what you may have found in a classified environment. That remains to be seen. The triangulation that I've just talked about, that can go both ways, obviously. But whilst I absolutely agree with the power and the exploitation potential of open source or publicly available information, the key for me now is not getting access to content, it's knowing what to do with the content when you've got the access. And that's about a skill set, and maybe it's a tool set thing that James has got a lot of proficiency in, but we're there to help customers, both in terms of getting access to curated stuff that we've done for them, or indeed we can train them on how to do it for themselves. But not knowing how to do it, I think, is the biggest reason why many analysts don't understand or indeed disregard the open source environment.
That's really, really useful, Harry. Thanks for that. Let's wrap up here. I think that's been a really useful discussion and fascinating for our audience. Hopefully they'll be able to come back to us with any questions and comments, etc., and get in touch. And we'll love to hear from anybody who's watched and listened to this webcast. I'm Terry Patter. I lead the Janes Intelligence Unit. If you want to find out more about our work, please come to the Janes website. And for anyone who hasn't been to the website in a while, you will see it has changed radically in the last couple of weeks, and it will be well worth a look. Particularly if you want to find out more about our work on threat assessment, go to janes.com/threats. I just want to say a final thank you to my guests on the podcast this week, Air Vice Marshal Sean Corbett and Global Vice President of Janes, Harry Kemsley. Thanks for joining us. It's been a great discussion. And I look forward to speaking to you more in the future about these topics.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks.
Thanks.